بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا ونبينا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. Inshallah, today we will be starting chapter number 8. This is a very, very important chapter in regards to the dressing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The word that is used for dressing in Arabic is libas. And that is why Imam Tirmidhi rahmahullah has used the same word, Babu ma ja'a fi libasi Rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions libas in the Quran in a very unique way. And He mentions, قَدْ أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ لِبَاسًا يُوَارِي سَوْآتِكُمْ وَرِيشًا وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that we have given you libas for multiple reasons. He mentions 3 reasons here, out of which 2 are external and 1 is internal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, يُوَارِي سَوْآتِكُمْ. Number 1 is so that we may cover the awrah, which is the area that we want to cover, or we need to cover. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala immediately after that mentions warisha. And clothing is also a means of beautification and appearing beautiful, appearing pleasing to one another. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a very unique internal reason, that is وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. And the clothing of taqwa is the best. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this external covering and internal beautification, there is a very deep connection between the two. And inshallah we'll go into a little bit of detail before we can commence this chapter, just as a form of introduction. We need to understand that clothing, outer appearance of an individual has a lot of effect on the inner behavior of an individual. The way we dress has an impact on the way we think, on the way we behave, on the way we speak. Everything that we do, all actions, to an extent, it is impacted by our dress code. There are 2 things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put very uniquely, that it has a lot of influence on an individual. There are 2 things. Number 1 is libas. The way a person dresses is the way his outer appearance has an impact on his inner behavior. Number 2 is the surrounding, the environment. These are the 2 things that have one of the greatest impacts on individuals. That we will see that even if a person himself is safe and sound when it comes to his mentality, his thinking, his behavior, everything might be good. But if he continuously dresses like an individual that is not of his type, and he continuously stays in an environment that is not appropriate, eventually his interior will start deteriorating. And we can see this very easily. If you were to take an example of how outer appearance has an impact on inner behavior, just look at, why is there a concept of uniform in the world? An army man, a police officer, he knows that when he has this uniform on, he's a different person than when he has the uniform off. So it's as if there's a very unique connection. And we can find very similar connection. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He sends us for Hajj, these are the 2 things that it is impacted on us on one of the large scales. Number 1, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes us out of our environment, out of the 4 walls that we live our life in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala immediately takes us out and takes us to a land far, far away. A perfect land. A land that is not surrounded by sin and vice, but rather is surrounded by nur, is surrounded by ibadah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts us in an environment where every individual is looking at another individual doing ibadah. Very rarely you will see any type of sin or vice. And then the second thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does in Hajj or Umrah, is to remove us from the clothing that we wear. It puts on a very unique uniform. A uniform which cannot distinguish a king from a normal servant, a poor from the rich, an average person from a leader, an alim to a layman. Regardless of who the person is, when we put on those two sheets of clothing, you cannot tell whether you're laying next to a king or you're laying next to an average individual. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes us out of our environment in Hajj and takes us out of our uniform and puts us in a very unique uniform. And this is why, if you look at it, Hajj has very big impact. And the ulama, when they discussed the hadith in which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouraged us to aim for Hajj Mabrur, that we should try to aim for our Hajj being accepted, the ulama say, if you see that there is a difference in your life from before Hajj to after Hajj, if this Hajj has helped us in staying away from sin and performing good deeds, that means that this was an acceptable Hajj. Meaning, if this Hajj did not have an impact on our inside, it did not have an impact on our Iman and Islam, that means that this Hajj might have not been the way it's supposed to be. So this is the true fundamental things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala utilizes to change our life, to drag us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you look at an average person, we walk into a department store. And, some people are very, very talented in showing their anger. When they're upset, they want to make sure that, and they carry very high talent in making sure that they let people around them know that they're very upset. If you look at a manager from a store, regardless of what a customer does, his job is to make sure that he stays calm and he tries the best of his ability to calm the customer down. And we see this day in and day out, that anytime there's any type of dispute between a manager and a customer, what does the manager do? You could be cursing at him. You could be saying all sorts of things, respectful, disrespectful. You can say anything. He might be changing colors, but he won't utter anything back to disrespect you or to disrespect that store. Why? Because he has the store uniform on. This is to protect his job, to protect his identity, to protect that uniform that he's wearing. And if you were to just meet that same individual anywhere else, Friday night he's buzzed off somewhere and you see him and you try to even give him a 10% of what you had given him in the store, you will see the true colors. And the true colors will come out. And this is, inshallah, when the time will allow us, we will talk about the difference between fabricated and artificial ethics and prophetic ethics. What Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us in akhlaq is different than the artificial ethics that people have adopted. So like this same individual example, that the only reason why he's, you might look at it that, subhanallah, this guy has very high manners and morals. No, these are because he's in such an environment and he's in such a uniform that he cannot change. That's why he is having the patience that he's having the tolerance that he's having. But the minute he's out of that uniform, he's out of that area, you'll see his true colors. And this is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he teaches us akhlaq. These are the true akhlaq that regardless of where we are and who we are dealing with, there is no difference between dealing when it comes to a Muslim and a non-Muslim. These are the things that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is very explicit, that it does not make a difference. As a Muslim, you're supposed to live the same lifestyle, whether it's day or night, whether you're at work or at home. Does not matter. These things will continue. So this is the difference. So just to give you an idea that external clothing does have a very big impact on our internal behavior. And this is exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning in this ayah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us two external purposes of dressing ourselves. One is obviously to cover our aura, which is something very natural. When we look at our environment, if you look at the community and the environment that we live in, we see that there is no haya, and there's no concept of haya. Again, we discussed this very lightly on a different note in a different chapter about the limitations of haya. And we see that there is no haya. But if you look at even a child, a 3-4-year-old child, if you try to change him in public, immediately he'll feel embarrassed. He'll feel, no, let's go somewhere else where there's some privacy. A child, you'll see that, okay, he dirtied his shirt. You want to take off his shirt and change his shirt in the middle of the mall. Immediately he will say, can we go to the restroom? Can we get somewhere private so that way I'm not in front of a large group of people? This is haya. And this is something natural that's put inside of us. And if you look at it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Adam alayhi salam committed a mistake, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, فَلَمَّا ذَاقَ الشَّجَرَةِ, as soon as they tasted the tree, the fruits from the tree, فَلَمَّا ذَاقَ الشَّجَرَةِ بَدَتْ لَهُمَا سَوْآتُهُمَا, their private organs were exposed. Their private areas were exposed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on to mention, what did they do immediately? They felt that guilt and they felt embarrassed, and immediately, وَطَفِقَا يَخْصِفَانِ عَلَيْهِمَا مِنْ وَرَقِ الْجَنَّةِ, they took the leaves from the trees and they started covering their awrah. They started covering their satar. So this is something very natural. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam, Adam and Eve, and there is no concept of environment, there's no concept of who has more haya, less haya. No, this is before the existence of this world. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pointed this out, that this is something natural. And through sin and vice, and through the effect and the impact of the environment, this haya slowly goes away. And slowly a time will come where we won't feel any guilt for not having any haya. And that's a little bit of a picture that we see nowadays in our environment. As far as external clothing is concerned, the fuqaha mention there are different types of external clothing. If you were to look at Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam assigned a specific area which must be covered at all times, which is called awrah, which is it's a terminology that is used in Arabic for covering the private area. This is compulsory. It is something wajib a person must do. There would be a difference of awrah between a man and a woman, but covering the awrah is wajib. It is something that is mandatory, and it must be done by every individual at all times when he can be seen, he or she can be seen by anybody. Second is preferable, something that is mustahab. And inshallah we'll go into a little bit of detail as to what is preferable to wear. A lot of times, if you look at the guidelines of dressing in Islam, guidelines of dressing in Sharia did not pinpoint that you should wear this and you should not wear this. It did not say that we're very limited to this specific type of clothing. Rather, it laid out a few guidelines as to what should be admired and what should be encouraged. And if you cannot, and if it's out of those guidelines, then it would become makruh or haram or something undesirable. So these steps, these guidelines, inshallah, we'll go into a little bit of detail in that in a minute. So mustahab would be wearing something white, new for Jummah and Eid. These things would be preferable. Something that is makruh, undesirable, it is for a wealthy person to wear something that is not showing gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for even granting him that type of life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He has granted us something, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see that ni'mah on us. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a ni'mah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to utilize that ni'mah. So similarly, if somebody gives us a gift, He would want to see us utilize that gift. Otherwise, it might hurt His feelings. So similarly, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us something worthy of wearing in public, something that is pleasant, something that is visibly and apparently pleasing, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would like us to wear that. And if we choose not to wear it, it's undesirable. And obviously haram, prohibited, would be wearing silk for men. So these are just some examples as to the different criteria. So now, some of the clothing would be wajib, that if a person is wearing certain clothing, he is fulfilling the obligation that is compulsory on him. Number two, some things would be preferable, that if a person, instead of just wearing an average clothes, if he looked at the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he he tried his best to accommodate the sunnahs of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it would be something preferable and mustahab and sunnah. And then obviously there are certain guidelines which will put us into makruh, and a step ahead would be haram. The fuqaha, looking at all these different lifestyles, all these different guidelines, they came up with 4 different principles in dressing. There are 4 principles that should be followed, which will make sure that we're keeping in mind all the different things that we just discussed. Number 1, whatever clothing we choose to wear, it must cover our awrah. Obviously, just to fulfill the obligation, it must cover our awrah. So, whether it's a male or a female, the awrah would be different, but it must cover our awrah. Number 2, it should be beautiful within the limitations of Sharia. Now, if you look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says it very beautifully, Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beautiful and He loves beauty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beautiful and He loves beauty. So we see whatever is appealing to an individual, to the people around him, whatever is appealing, that's what should be worn. When it comes to awrah, when it comes to completing or covering our awrah, our satar, this is the limitation that we have to do this. But the next 2 would tell us in which fashion it should be done. Obviously, it should be clothing that is considered pleasing to every individual. Nowadays, fashion has is taken to a whole another level. And because of that, there are specific designs. And the designers have made an attempt to cater certain clothing to different individuals. And wearing those clothing and belonging to any specific designer group would automatically group us in these individual groups, and that will give us an identity. And inshallah, that's what we're going to discuss next, that it should not be worn with the intention of imitation of a specific group. It should not be worn with an intention to imitate a specific group, especially that group that is not amongst the groups of Islam. Obviously, if you look at all the different Islamic clothing that we find, if it's not any one of them, then obviously we are relating ourselves into that group. And that itself should not be adopted. Inshallah, we'll go into a little bit of detail a little later in regards to what is tashabbuh. We talked about this before. Obviously, we did not have time. But what is imitation? There's different types of imitation. What is imitation? So inshallah, we'll get into that right after that. But the one thing is that it should not imitate another group. And number 2, it should not be with the intention to exhibit oneself in front of others. A lot of times, something is worn. It could be done with 2 intentions. It could be done because this gown or this coat or this specific garment is pleasing to me and my family and something that I'm wearing for myself to look beautiful. But it's a whole another level to do it so you may appear beautiful in the sight of others. So you might be superior to them. It's a very fine line. It's a very fine line, and shaitan will play us, and it will put us in this situation almost every time. When you're wearing something, you always have this doubt that, am I wearing it for myself, or am I wearing it so I may appear superior to someone else? So I may exhibit myself as a model to someone else. So this is a very fine line. So the best thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. As we mentioned in the beginning of the session, that libasu taqwa, a garment which represents taqwa. And that is the best. And if you look at the one that is coming after, it should not cause any pride or arrogance inside of a person. And this is exactly what that is referring to. Immediately we talked about it. If a person is wearing a $2,000 suit, And, you'll be surprised that there would be a gathering where everyone's suit or a gown is worth over $2,000. And this is without any exaggeration. This is a scenario that takes place almost every weekend in almost every town. When we put on a suit of that caliber, of that price tag, immediately it's going to have an impact on us. If we put that on and we walk down the street and we see a person who is wearing a piece of clothing that is probably, the price tag on that is probably equaling to the button or the zipper of what we are wearing, immediately our egos are going to start doing gymnastics, because we know that this is going to affect our inside. Because the clothing that we put on ourselves automatically have an impact on the inside. So this is something that we need to make sure that when we put it on, whatever clothing that we put on, it should never lead us to thinking of ourselves to be superior to anyone. And it should not lead us to pride or arrogance over any other individual. These are the 4 principles that have been mentioned in regards to all the different clothing that is mentioned, that some are wajib, some are mustahab. When we look at the clothing, there are 3 things that need to be looked at. It should be covering our body to the maximum ability. That is our principle. That is something that we do. That all the time, if our clothing can allow us to cover ourselves cover ourselves fully, then it should cover ourselves as much as possible. Obviously, looking at the different weather, looking at the different situations that we're working in, obviously it should be fully covered. Number 2, it should not be defeating the purpose of covering, which is obviously would be more relevant to the women rather than the men, but it should not be so see-through that it's pointless even wearing that. So it should not be so thin that there is no difference between wearing and not wearing. And we find that is something that it is pretty common, at least in the women fashion world. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the signs of Day of Judgment, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned, Kasiyatun ariyatun. Women will be dressed, but yet they would be naked. So Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, they did not understand. Their concept, whenever they hear Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam utter any words, they said, Amanna wa saddaqna. We believe and we know you're truthful, we accept. There's no ifs and buts. We accepted it. But how would that be possible? And we see that example now. That a person would be wearing clothes from the head to the toe. But we see that is as if the person's not wearing anything. Kasiyatun, ariyatun. Very simple. So similarly, that's the number 2 rule. One should be that it should be covering. When we say covering, it should be that it's not see-through. That is basically defeating the purpose of wearing clothes. Number 2, it should not expose any body limbs to the way it's supposed to be. So for example, if you are wearing a shirt, so that way your body can be hidden, but the shirt is so tight that it's as if you're not wearing it. It's in the same ruling as your skin. Then it's kind of defeating the purpose of wearing that shirt. So that's the 3rd thing to remember. That it should be covering. It should not be covering, defeating the purpose by being see-through. And number 3 is that it should be loose enough that any body part that needs to be covered it's not so tight that it's exposing the body part as if it's not covered. So these are the 3 things to keep in mind when we are choosing our clothing and our dress code. Umar radiallahu anhu used to say that refrain from 2 types of clothing. He said refrain from 2 types of clothing. And subhanAllah, Umar radiallahu anhu was filled with wisdom. He said 2 types of clothing. He said when you approach a person, he's going to judge you. He's going to try to judge you with these 2 things. Either you're so overdressed that he would try to label you as superior. So he said, libas mashhura. Refrain from libas mashhura. Mashhur, shohra actually means to be famous. So he'll try to label you with putting you superior to him. So he said, make sure you're not dressed in such high caliber that he will start labeling you as someone superior. And at the same time, if you're not well dressed, then he will try to label you someone inferior. He will try to label you someone inferior. So he said, refrain from libase mahkura. Haqir, something very light, something very minute, something that does not have too much value. Umar radiallahu anh said, make sure that you do not go to any one of the extremes. That when a person cites you, he's not putting you above himself, but yet he's not putting you below himself. And if you look at it, Sharia never prescribes to dress as if we are, in a way that we do not have proper clothing. No, Sharia specifically prescribes us to wear clothing which is respectable. It's zina. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that it is a form of beauty for us, and we should attain that beautification. But at the same time, it has to be within the guidelines of Sharia. It has to be within the guidelines of Sharia. And again, as we mentioned, that these principles that we talked about, it goes for men and women both. And, I would just like to quickly touch bases with this imitation issue. There is something Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." Whoever imitates a nation, he would be amongst them. Whoever imitates a nation, he would be amongst them. In another narration, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions that al-mar'u ma'a man ahabba. A person would be raised among those individuals whom he loves. So, Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, they had this question that, Ya Rasulullah, who would we be raised with? So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in reply to that, he mentioned, Al-mar'u ma'a man ahabba. That you'll be raised with whomever you love. One golden rule about imitation is that whether we accept it or not, if we're imitating a group for the sake of imitation, see, there's two different words that is used. There's two different terminologies that is used when it comes to imitation. One is tashabbuh, one is mushabaha. Tashabbuh and mushabaha are two separate things. One is mushabaha. We wore a dress code which resembled someone else. And therefore, we might have appeared like that individual or like that group. That is mushabaha. Also, although that itself is not preferred, but that is still to an extent acceptable. One is tashabbuh, is to imitate an individual or imitate a group or imitate any symbol for the sake of imitation. If we put on some clothing because we're going to a gathering which has individuals of that belief, or which have individuals that have certain principles and certain beliefs about a specific group or religion or something, and we put on this specific attire to go to that gathering, we are not only resembling them, but we are attempting to imitate them 100%. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam very specifically mentioned that if something, an imitation is done with this intention, man tashabbaha biqawmin, if any individual explicitly imitates an individual or a group, fahuwa minhum, he is amongst them. And we know that this imitation, explicit imitation, it is done with, the only reason why it's done is because we have some value of that individual or that group in our hearts. This is the truth. And eventually, the true color will come out. If we continue to dress like an individual, continue to dress like a group, eventually those habits and attributes that are linked to that group would automatically begin to appear within us. Just the way the environment has an effect on us, that if we're hanging around an individual, a certain individual or a group that continuously use profound language, there would be a time when, without any intent, we would start. And then initially it would be unintentional, then it would slowly turn into intentional, and it would be, then it would almost become second nature. And this is the effect. So similarly, anytime tashabbuh is done, the first thing to remember is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned, that if you imitate a group, you are amongst them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran amazing ayah. And this verse actually gives us an understanding as to how severe the situation is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارِ وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارِ. Do not lean. Rukun means to lean, to rest on something. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, do not lean towards those individuals, الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا, who transgressed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not say, إِلَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. He did not say that those who disbelieve. He's not talking about kuffar, munafiqeen, or any of those. He's only talking about those individuals who are involved in sin and vice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not only that He is talking about imitating them, He is talking about only leaning towards them. وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. Don't even lean towards those individuals who have done wrong to themselves. فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارِ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, if you do this, the fire will surely touch you. The fire will surely touch you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is keeping it right at the surface. He says, if you lean towards them, the fire will touch you. And we can just draw the second conclusion, that if we were to completely imitate them, what would happen? And again, I would like to emphasize this point, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only talking about إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. That only talking about those who transgress. It's not talking about the disbelievers, it's not talking about the munafiqeen and kuffar. It's only talking about those who transgress. Those who actually committed sin and who are in a lifestyle full of vice and sin. So we are ordered from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to even lean towards that lifestyle. And amazingly, Imam Malik ibn Dinar, he used to mention this quote. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَوْحَى اللَّهُ إِلَى النَّبِيِّ مِنَ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed a verse, a narration to one of the previous prophets. And he said, tell your people, لَا تَدْخُلُوا مَدْخَلَ أَعْدَائِي. Do not enter the dwellings of my enemies. Do not enter those enemies which are my enemies. Do not enter the dwellings of those individuals who are my enemies. وَلَا يَلْبِسُوا مَلَابِسَ أَعْدَائِي. Do not wear those clothing which is the clothing and the attire of my enemy. وَلَا يَرْكَبُوا مَرَاكِبَ أَعْدَائِي. And do not ride and do not transport yourself from one place to another in the same manner, in the same fashion as the way my enemies do it. وَلَا يَطْعَمُوا مَطَاعِمَ أَعْدَائِي. And do not eat those foods that my enemies eat. فَيَكُونُوا أَعْدَائِي كَمَا هُمْ أَعْدَائِي. Otherwise, you will become my enemies just the way they are my enemies. Very beautifully put. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly mentions that shaitan and his groups are enemies to us, all the believers, the believing men and women. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly mentions that if he is your enemy, you should refrain from anything that is that he or his group would do. So these are the few things that we need to keep in mind. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, throughout Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life, he always emphasized that Muslims should have their own identity. A believer, by looking at a believer, you could tell he's a believer. And this is exactly how it was when a new person would enter Masjid al-Nabawi and he would see the entire group of people. He could not tell Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam apart from anyone else, because they were all dressed the same, they were all looking the same, everything was the same. So even when Umar radiallahu anh, when the conquest just increased in his khilafah, obviously Umar radiallahu anh, we know that a lot of lands were conquered. Umar radiallahu anh especially made an attempt to write to all the people who are fighting in the battles and who are traveling abroad to make sure that they hold on to the sunnah of Ismail alayhi salam. He specifically mentioned this in his letter to the different armies of that time who were traveling abroad, that make sure you hold on to the sunnah, which is the principle and the base value of our religion, that do not forget your identity. Because obviously they were intermingling with a lot of new groups and different people with different backgrounds, whether they accepted Islam or not, but they came with their own cultures and their own traditions. So Umar radiallahu anh specifically wrote to them multiple times to make sure that they do not forget the Muslim identity. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you will see that throughout the ahadith there is a pattern. That Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say Khalif al-Mushrikeen. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say Khalif al-Yahud, say Khalif al-Kufar. Different time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that no, you need to oppose them because Islam has its own identity. And if you look at 10th of Muharram, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam fasted on the 10th, the Ashura, the 10th of Muharram. And then when he found out that the Jews of that time would also fast on 10th of Muharram, he said, if I was alive the next year, I would also fast on either the 9th or the 11th, just for the purpose of opposing them. Just so that Muslims can have their own identity. Similarly, when we see about lengthening the beard and trimming the mustache, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the beginning of that narration is Khalif al-Mushrikeen, awful laha wa ahfi shawarib. That oppose the mushrikeen, oppose those polytheists who do not believe in any God, and lengthen your beard and trim your mustaches. Similarly, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the mushrikeen in Makkah would tie their imama without a kufi. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, tie your imama on top of a kufi. So that way you can oppose them. And this Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam telling us that we carry a very specific identity. We carry a Islamic code of life. And that exactly we need to keep in mind when we're choosing our attire. Obviously, this is not to draw lines as to what is allowed and what is not allowed. It's about what is preferable and which guidelines we should keep in mind when we're choosing our attire. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to act upon everything that is said. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to adopt all the different narrations that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam gave us in regards to dressing. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. مولاي صل وسلم